There's a piece called Getting Real About Reparations. It's by historian Roger McGrath. He's been a guest on the Larry Elder Show. And he points out that the U.S. government never owned slaves. That, of course, the United States fought a war. Though not initiated to abolish slavery, it ended the practice. Casualty figures on the Union side, 400,000 dead, maybe 300,000 wounded. And now the descendants of these dead and maimed soldiers are, through taxation, supposed to pay for descendants of slaves freed by the very same soldiers. You know, the United States didn't come into being until 1788 when the Constitution was ratified. So when the New York Times talks about 250 years of slavery, the 1619 Project, they're not talking about the United States. Slavery existed in the United States for 77 years. In 1619, by the way, a handful, says Roger McGrath, of African slaves were in the British colony of Virginia. The slaves were sold by the captain of an English privateer sailing under Dutch authority, which intercepted and captured a Portuguese slave ship in the Caribbean en route from Africa to Mexico. The captain knew better than to try to sell the slaves at an island port in the Caribbean, and instead sailed north to Virginia. But this was not typical. European slavers normally purchased slaves at a port in equatorial West Africa from a tribal chieftain in exchange for rum and other European trading goods. Africans were often enslaved as a consequence of losing a war to a more powerful tribe, or being captured in a raid, or being sold by their own family to cover debts. Best evidence suggests, he writes, that Africans had been enslaving each other for thousands of years by the time the Europeans arrived on African shores. By then, Arabs had been trading for slaves from the same area, West Equatorial Africa, for several hundred years. But instead of loading the ships onto ocean-going ships, Arab slavers took them up the Niger River or on overland trails to Timbuktu. That was the point of departure for caravans that crossed the Sahara to Egypt on foot. European transported slaves in the opposite direction, westward across the Atlantic to South America, especially Brazil, and to the Caribbean and Central America. Only a small minority of slaves came to the British North American colonies. Yet the largest population of blacks in the Western Hemisphere today is in the U.S. He says there's a reason for that. The voyage to Brazil was relatively quick and easy, making slaves fairly inexpensive, which meant they were expendable. The opposite was the case for the voyage to Virginia. Slaves were expensive and became more so when American participation in the international slave trade ended in 1808, as required by the Constitution. Slaves were far better fed, clothed, housed, and treated medically on these shores than they were in other places, especially Brazil, simply because the owner would lose a boatload of money should the slave die. This, of course, does not condone or justify slavery, but it is to say that the treatment of slaves varied greatly in America. And if you read the novel Harriet Beecher Stowe, which was based on interviews with several slaves, the treatment of slaves varied dramatically within even the South. McGrath goes on to say that, meanwhile, by the way, this is how complicated this thing gets, there were more than 250,000 free blacks in the South, and nearly 4,000 of them were slave masters who owned more than 20,000 black slaves. William Ellison, only one of several hundred black slaveholders in South Carolina, owned 63 slaves, as recorded in the U.S. Census of 1860. In Charleston, 125 free blacks were slaveholders, and in Charleston City, the port city, the largest owner of slaves was a black woman. More on this when we come back. Altogether, in 1860, the population of America was around 30 million. About almost 4 million were slaves, or about 12.6% of the population. 4.9% of people owned slaves. Of all the families in America, 4.7% were slave owners. All of this and more. I'm Larry Elder. We were talking about an article written by Roger McGrath called Getting Real About Reparations. about how complicated this would be. He also talks about the way Irish were treated. He says the planters in the Old South were generally far more concerned about the welfare of their slaves than they were about counterparts elsewhere. And he points out that this concern did not extend to white laborers, those who were hired to do a job that was considered to be too exhausting or too dangerous for a black slave because slaves were more expensive. The architect of New York's Central Park is named Frederick Law Olmsted. He traveled through the South on the eve of the Civil War and was shocked to find that Irishmen were used instead of slaves for work in draining swampland, felling trees, digging ditches, quarrying rocks, clearing forests. And he asked a ship captain why black slaves were not doing the work. And the captain said, quote, "The N-words are worth too much to be risked here. If the," and he used a slur for Irish, "were knocked overboard or get their backs broke, nobody loses anything," end of quote. McGrath writes that the death rate among Irish laborers was shocking and has been that case for decades. The New Basin Canal, which connects New Orleans to Lake Pontchartrain, was built by Irish laborers in the 1830s. Irish workmen dug the canal with hand shovels, excavating more than 500,000 cubic yards of earth. No dynamite. They used axes to fell huge, bald cypress trees along the route. They were paid $20 a month and given room and board. More than 10,000, some estimates put the number as high as 30,000 Irish workers died in the process. They died of cholera. They died of yellow fever. They died of alligator attacks. They died of water moccasin bites. So much for white privilege. Meanwhile, there were more than 250,000 free blacks in the South, and nearly 4,000 of them owned slaves, more than 20,000 slaves. William Ellison, one of several hundred black slaveholders in South Carolina, owned 63, as recorded in the 1860 census. I mentioned this before. In Charleston, 125 free blacks were slaveholders, and in Charleston City, the port city for Charleston, the largest owner of slaves was a black woman. Black partners August Angel and Mistress Horry owned 84 slaves each and were notorious for slave trading. In neighboring North Carolina, 69 blacks were slave owners. The most prominent of them was a man named John Stanley, who owned three plantations and 163 slaves, one of dozens of black slave masters in Maryland. Nat Butler owned a farm, but made his real money from slave trading. He lured runaway slaves to his farm, and then, depending upon the size of the reward, either returned them to their owner or sold them to plantations in the Deep South. The largest concentration of black slave owners was in Louisiana. One owned 287 slaves on more than 1,000 acres of land. McGrath writes that black slave masters are generally omitted from most textbooks in American history or mentioned as only having bought a family member to free them. He said that did occur, but only in a minority of cases. Generally speaking, they were used for work. Also regularly omitted is the person who established the precedent for slavery in the first place, Anthony Johnson. He was one of those slaves sold in 1619 in Virginia. By law, though, he was sold as an indentured servant. When he served his term of indenture, he was freed and awarded with land. He became a successful tobacco farmer and bought indentured servants, both black and white, to work his land. When he refused to release one of them, a black field hand named John Castor, from his indenture, a white neighbor for whom Castor wanted to work supported Castor in suing for his freedom. Now, Johnson, the black slave owner, argued that Castor was never a slave, was never a indentured servant, because he never signed a contract of indenture. He was rather a slave, and therefore, Johnson argued, he was under no obligation to release him. In 1654, the colonial court, the English courts, decided in Johnson's favor, making him, a former black slave from Africa, the first legal slave owner in the American colonies. When we come back, we're going to talk about the thousands of slaves that were owned by Native Americans. And why is nobody speaking out about black slavery in 5 countries as we speak in Africa? Now, I was talking about how complicated it would be for those who are proposing reparations to come out with some sort of formula. We haven't even talked about the role of African chieftains in the slave trade. Now, he said if blacks owned thousands of black slaves, and they did, so too did American Indians, or people we now call Native Americans. By the middle of the 1700s, various tribes, especially the so-called 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, began to acquire black slaves. And by the end of the century, the Cherokee owned nearly 1,000. The Greek, the Seminole, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw owned thousands more. Numbers grew sharply, he said, during the early 19th century when the tribes were removed to the Indian Territory, mostly during the 1830s. They took thousands of black slaves with them. Accompanying the Cherokee on their Trail of Tears were some 2,000 black slaves, and they were put to work on farms in the new tribal home, raising cotton, corn, crops, tending hogs and cattle. At the time, a Methodist minister named Henry C. Benson said, quote, "As far as they are able, even the very poor Indians will manage to get possession of 1 or 2 Negroes to perform their heavy work. Indians are known to cherish an invincible disgust for manual labor," close quote, and thus used slaves. He writes that the 5 civilized tribes cooperated fully with the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, whether this meant returning slaves to white owners or to Indian slave masters, they returned them. In 1842, in an organized action, some 20 black slaves stole firearms and ran away from their Cherokee owners. They stole horses and mules along the way, headed south into the Creek Nation, and they were joined by 15 runaway slaves. The combined group came upon a white man, James Edwards, and his Delaware Indian sidekick, Billy Wilson, who were returning some runaway slaves to the Choctaw, and they killed them both. Meanwhile, a force of Cherokee and Creek, in an unusual instance of cooperation, were hot on the runaways' trail. They captured them near Red River. 5 of the slaves were later found guilty of the murders of Edwards and the Indian sidekick, and were put to death. The rest were returned to their owners. What punishment they suffered, he writes, is unknown. Now, the 13th Amendment, ratified in the fall of 1865, abolished slavery in the U.S. as a whole, but not among the 5 civilized tribes. Now, although the Indians were under protection of the United States, it was unclear how the Constitution would apply to them. As a consequence, blacks remained as slaves in the Indian Territory until July and August 1866, after the U.S. government negotiated new treaties with the individual tribes that included specific clauses prohibiting slavery. Even then, some slaveholders among the so-called 5 civilized tribes did not comply until 1867. End of quote. This entire piece, very lengthy, is up on LarryElder.com. It's written by historian Roger McGrath. It's called Getting Real About Reparations. Check it out. There are several African countries where slavery is still practiced. The African states with the highest per capita rate of modern-day slaves: Eritrea, 63 per 1,000. Burundi, 40 per 1,000. Central African Republic, 22.3. Mauritania, 21.4 per 1,000. South Sudan, 20.5. Somalia, 15.5. The Congo, 13.7. Sudan, I guess that's Northern Sudan, 12. Chad, 12. This is per 1,000. Rwanda, 11.6 per 1,000. Don't hear too much about that, do you?